Watching the Anglo-Saxon war machine, mechanized mendacity, moving across the terrain of public opinion is an awesome sight. I've seen it before, of course, in the run-up to Iraq, but given that that ended in 1 million dead people, ISIS and Al-Qaeda cascading around the whole world, no weapons of mass destruction, the whole thing an unmitigated disaster, I honestly didn't think they would try it quite the same way again. I certainly didn't think that a considerable number of Pavlov's dogs would rally to the same old messages from the same old messengers. But I'm afraid I was wrong. It is a chastening experience. I thought the public had more sense. I thought the broadcasting and media class had more shame. More fool me. Actually, they are utterly shameless. The journalists and broadcasters have no need to be bribed or twist. The average British and American journalist will lie on cue and with such conviction that one is waiting for them to take the onion from their pocket, hold it to their nose and begin to cry like maddos on screen about poor, plucky Nazi Azov battalion in the Ukrainian National Guard, currently firing shells and mortars and even heavier artillery bringing up the rear on the line of control between eastern Ukraine and the Ukrainian coup government in Kiev. I suppose all of my protestations have probably been in vain. I told you from the beginning of this crisis that it was a complete lie that Russia was preparing to invade Ukraine. But I also told you from the first that Ukraine was probably preparing to invade. 30% of its own population who live in the east of the country in the self-proclaimed People's Breakaway Republics. These are ethnically Russian people for whom Russian is the language, a language completely delegitimized on the very night that the parliament building in Kiev was set on fire. The president set scarpering out of the country and the MPs held at gunpoint until they signed the law which delegitimized the Russian language. Unfortunately for the coup mobsters, there is 30% of the country that simply can't indeed accept that because Russian is their language. They are ethnically Russian, and hundreds of thousands of them, indeed, are dual citizens with Russia. So you had irresistible force meets immovable object. And a desultory but very bloody war continued for several years along that line of control until the Minsk agreements. The Minsk agreements, of course, are the property of the Security Council of the United Nations, which adopted them in toto and unanimously. And therefore, the Minsk agreements have the power of international law. But a window into the soul of the enemies of peace was given, perhaps unwittingly, by the head of the Moscow Bureau of the Carnegie Foundation. I do hope he's not in Moscow. I do hope the Russian government has begun to move these kind of Trojan horses along. But whether he is in Moscow or not, he's the head of the Moscow Bureau. He said last night on social media, the game is now clear. Russia seeks to coerce the Ukrainian government into implementing the Minsk agreements. How do you coerce someone into an agreement they've already signed. Of course, they haven't implemented it, but shouldn't everyone be seeking to coerce them to do so? Why is it being left to Russia to coerce them to do so? What about Germany and France, who are co-signatories with the Ukraine government to the Minsk agreement? What about the United Nations Security Council, which has now embraced the Minsk agreements as their own? What do the Minsk agreements do? They call for a ceasefire along that line of control. They call for the withdrawal of foreign forces from that area. It's going to be difficult now that it's stuffed full of foreign soldiers and mercenaries and Western-supplied weapons paid for by you, the taxpayer in America and in Britain. And they call for the granting of autonomous status for the Donbass region, which is currently being heavily attacked by the forces of the Ukrainian military, including their fascist boot boys grouped around the Azov battalion. Now, if I'm right, and if this bombardment becomes a general offensive, and all of the troop movements suggest that it is, then, of course, a full-scale attack on the ethnically Russian people next door to Russia is going to bring Russia into the war. And if Russia enters the war, it might as well continue it. I don't speak for Russia. I don't know the Russian mind in this. I can only tell you what I would do. I would say, if you will not push back NATO's tanks from my lawn, I will have to push them back for you. If you continue to encroach further and further to the Russian state borders, I'll have to do something about it. It will be military and it will be technical, to use the words that the Russians use. I have no idea what that military technical response will be, but I suspect that the West and its satrapies will not like it. This has been a war of choice, not by the West, as you keep hearing on the state-mandated British Broadcasting Corporation, because Germany and France are in the West, not by the international community, because Germany and France and Russia and China and India and Iran and the Arab world and the African world and the Asian world are all part of the international community. You arrogant hypocrites, what they mean is the Anglosphere, the AUKUS, Australia, UK, US, the Anglosphere, the Five Eyes. That's what they mean by the West. That's what they mean by the international community, and it's time the entire world told them, your days of ruling the waves, your days of ordering other people around and invading and occupying them at will are over. And if you won't accept it, we'll have to prove it to you by force of arms on the battlefield. That's my point of view. It may or may not be Russia's. But who's that I hear? Who's that little fellow in his golden hose coming out of the Élysée Palace? It's little Macron. He's been on the blower all day to Putin, and he's got a solution. He wants to broker by this night a ceasefire on the line of control between Ukraine and the autonomous republics it agreed to in the Minsk agreements. He wants a summit at what he calls the highest level. He'll need to sit on a few cushions if it's at the highest level. But good old Macron, I say, the French people don't want war. The German people don't want war. That's why they didn't send any weapons. Perhaps it was the presence of the swastikas and the death's head insignias and the jackboots and the goose-stepping and the swastika flags flying in Kiev that put them off. All they sent were clean helmets with no swastikas on them. And they didn't let Britain send weapons to the Kiev regime either. They forced them to fly around German airspace. If President Macron succeeds, then he deserves the praise of all humanity. I know he's doing it for revenge on Joe Biden and Boris Johnson for stabbing him in the back and stealing 100 million euros from France in the aborted French submarine deal with the Australians. You can't steal billions of people's money and expect them to be sanguine about it. No. I know he's doing it because he's got a presidential election coming up very soon. I know that. I don't care why he's doing it. He's doing it. Just like Chirac had the courage to stand up against the Anglo-American bullies over the Iraq War. Just like Herr Schroeder, Herr Schultz has made it clear that Germany wants no part of this. I'll tell you what, Europe, I tell you this with all the power of my being. If you don't stop being led by the nose by Boris Johnson and Joe Biden, your countries will be the ones that will pay the highest price in war and in economic and financial ruin. It's your people that will pay the highest price. It's about time you stood up to the bully boys. Now, Her Majesty the Queen's not well. I'm very sorry to hear it. I wish her even longer life. I'd be voting no in our poll. Is it now time for Her Majesty the Queen to abdicate? A, yes. B, no. I myself don't want Her Majesty the Queen to abdicate, but I demand a referendum when in the fullness of time she passes, as all must pass, because I ain't going quietly into the reign of bonkers Charles and Queen Camilla. I promise you that. I will agitate everywhere on every platform that Britain must be given the choice between monarchy and democracy. That's the choice, and we in Britain have to decide when to take it. But having said all that, with the COVID and with a son who just paid £12 million sterling to a woman he's never met, with whom he never danced, with whom he never sweated. As a matter of fact, he was in Pizza Express in Woking at the time in question. A woman he didn't put his arm round, a woman he didn't meet in Ghislaine Maxwell's apartment, a woman he was never photographed with, a woman he's never met. He gave her £12 million in a New York City courtroom just this week. I drove past the palace this evening. There's a very long queue of women that Andrew has never met, offering to make a settlement with him for less than £12 million. One after the other. Her children have disappointed her. The only one worth the proverbial pitcher of warm human fluids is Princess Anne. But she was ruled out from the start because she was the wrong gender. Long before the gender wars broke out, Princess Anne was ruled out because she didn't have a dig. Just think about that. So we'll be talking about the war. We'll be talking about the royals. But we can't talk about Andrew without talking about the strange death of Jean-Luc Brunel. Who was Jean-Luc Brunel? He was a pimp for the pimp Ghislaine Maxwell and the pervert and spy Jeffrey Epstein. Jean-Luc was in jail. It was a modern jail. It had all mod cons, including security cameras. But in yet another astounding coincidence, the cameras in Jean-Luc's cell weren't working when he too wrapped the paper sheets around his neck and hanged himself until he was dead. And if you believe any of that, I have a bridge here in London I can sell you, going very, very cheap. This is like a second-rate mafia movie where all the chief suspects keep getting bumped off before they can talk in the court and incriminate the rich and powerful for whom these pimps were supplying. How come we know the name of every donor that gave money to the Canadian Freedom Convoy Fund, but we don't know a single name of the people for whom Epstein and Maxwell and Brunel were pimping? How come they're all redacted? Shouldn't we know the name of the rich and powerful people, presidents, prime ministers, members of the royal family, princes of the church, princes of Wall Street, princes of international capitalism? Shouldn't we know their names in this day and age? Or are they going to bump off Ghislaine Maxwell next? Is that their game? Lastly, just as I came on air, I discovered that there's another giant bank leak. This one from Credit Suisse. 80 billion pounds worth of deposits from thieves and criminals everywhere who stole that money from their people and who were allowed to lodge it in a respectable bank called Credit Suisse. Some of them even after they were convicted of murder. Some of them after they were convicted of people trafficking. Some of them when they were wanted by their own country after they had been driven out of power. I haven't had time to digest it fully yet, but I have looked down it far enough to see that the sinister torturer of the Mubarak regime in Egypt, Omar Suleiman, who kidnapped me and the editor of this show, Ron Mackay, in the dead of night, bundled us into an unmarked van, drove us through the desert, had me waking up the British ambassador in the middle of the night to tell him men without uniforms have kidnapped me and are taking me across the desert. Help! Omar Suleiman, a police officer, a humble police officer in poor, dear Egypt. He had a bank account at Credit Suisse with $300 million in it. A torturer, Omar. That we knew. A torturer and a thief. Oh, I really do hope one day, if not now, then on the judgment day, I get to give evidence against you.